Hey everyone, this is going to serve as kind of a catch-all video for a whole lot of questions, different questions that come in but maybe kind of fit in a similar category. And those are questions just pertaining to resources. And so we always get a very common question asking about Midrash. What is the Midrash? How do I read it? How do I study it? All those kinds of things. I made a video years ago. It's kind of an old video. It's pretty dated. I've grown a lot since I made that video, but I think it still does the trick. So I will put that video, I'll link that video in the description. I didn't feel like I needed to make a new one at this point. I've grown some, I've learned a lot, but I think that video still does what we need it to do. Another video I made right at the same time, and one of the questions we get is, how do I use resources to dig deeper into the Bible? Like how do I use like lexicons and do word studies? And there's a video I made that just kind of shows you how to use different tools and all those kinds of things. BibleGateway.com, basic word search stuff. I mean, just kind of like basic entry level things. I'll link that video in the description. People often will want to know just like, what are the books I can read to learn this? And guys, there's no easy way to answer that question. It's not like there are like 10 books. If you read these books, it covers it. I've been reading books every single day for the last 20 years, and I plan on doing it for the next 50 if I'm still alive. And it's just it's an endless discipline and practice of studying and learning. There's no like aggregate source of, I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but like there's no singular stream of if you just read these, it does the trick. So I'll link all the resources that we have recommended in the podcast. That will be in the description of this video. It's going to be overwhelming. It's a long list, but that's because there's a lot of stuff that we've learned from, and we're just going to keep learning. If you're not wired that way, do not make yourself guilty about that. Some of us are teachers. Some of us want to dig in. Some of us want to read every single day for the next 50 years. That's who we are, and we're going to lean into that because that's the part we play in the body of Christ. If you're not a teacher or a student in that way, that's not what fills your soul. Like, that's not what Jesus expects of you. You're not going to be given a spiritual SAT test at the end of this to see how much Bible knowledge you have. But those are all just stuff that's out. But there's no shortcut. There's no way to cut the corner. It's just a long journey, and you begin, and you kind of go on from there. I have always recommended starting with Lois Tuerberg. Like, if you're just getting started, start with Lois Tuerberg's books. Sitting at the feet of Rabbi Jesus, walking in the dust of Rabbi Jesus, reading the Bible with Rabbi Jesus. Those are some of the best, most accessible, and they still cover this deep, profound material, but some of the most accessible material for beginners that I've ever found. So I always tell people, start with her books, Lois Tuerberg, and find her books and start there. Let's see here. Some of the other questions that we get are about translation. We get that email quite a bit. What translation do you use? What's your favorite translation? Whatever that might be. Translation is a dynamic work. There is no one translation that's going to be perfect. There's no one translation that's even going to be the best. Like, every translation is going to bring something unique, a strength, a weakness, because there's no perfect way. Translation will always be a dynamic work. That's the nature of translation. You can't just take this language and make it this language. There are things that get lost in translation. There are many words or ideas that don't have a direct representation in this language or that language. And so there's always going to be decisions that have to be made. We're going to lean this way. We're going to go that way. We're going to make this choice, and that's translation. So now, having said that, all translations are not created equal. Just because everything's going to bring a strength and a weakness doesn't mean that there aren't some translations that are just flat out bad, which means there are also translations that are good. But it will be hard to answer that question objectively, okay? A lot of these things about translation are a matter of preference. Some of them have more objectivity to them. But at the end of the day, it's all about perspective and preference and what you're looking for in a translation. And so there's a lot of translations that I generally use. My go-to translation is the NIV, the newest version of the NIV you can get your hands on. That would be right now, as I record this video, the 2011 update of the New International Version. 2011 NIV is what I use. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Number one, it's the Bible that I grew up with. I grew up from my childhood on. My personal Bibles and the Bibles that we use in the churches that I attended were almost always exclusively NIV. And that's the Bible that I know. That's the Bible that I got familiar with. Second of all is that the NIV it is not rooted and it's not beholden to any one particular denomination or doctrinal persuasion. So the NIV is not coming from a Reformed perspective. It's not coming from a Baptist perspective. It's not coming from a Catholic perspective. The scholars that have contributed to the NIV are a diverse group coming from diverse perspectives, and I like that because that means that there is less, not none. It just means there's less doctrinal bias and persuasion that's shaping the translation. So the ESV is oftentimes a very accurate translation, and yet it's not my preference for two reasons. It's not as readable, so it doesn't read in the English quite as well as I would like it to. And B, it's coming from a Reformed doctrinal perspective. The folks that put together the ESV are coming, that body of scholarship is coming from a particular bent, which means they have a particular bias that shapes their translation. That's the ESV. The Christian Standard used to be called the Holman Christian Standard, and now it's just called the Christian Standard Bible. Comes from a more Baptist persuasion. There's a doctrinal reference point that's going to shape the way that they engage in that translation, and I think that comes out in the Christian Standard. There are translations I'm just not a fan of. I'm not a fan of the Passion Translation. Like objectively, I just think it's not an accurate translation. It's very much shaped by a more, let's say, a more Pentecostal persuasion. I'm sure my Pentecostal brothers and sisters probably see that maybe differently. It's just objectively not my favorite translation. I had to use the NASB, the New American Standard. I had to use that in college, and that probably gave me a bad taste in my mouth. I hated the translation then. I hate the translation now. I had a brief stint with the NLT, the New Living Translation, and that didn't last very long. Just not a fan of that translation. Let's see, are there any others that I just am not a fan of? But I have respect for the King James. I know but understanding what the King James is, that translation coming from that part of history with all the baggage that it brings with it, I get it, granted, the translation itself still is very valuable to me. I do love the Message. Let's go to the complete other side of the conversation. I love the Message. I like what Eugene Peterson was doing. My favorite version of the Message is one that was called the Message Remix. It was redone by Nav Press. The Remix. That's my favorite version of the Message that I've ever encountered. I think the translation work is actually the best there. And I know that everybody wants to use words like translation and paraphrase. Like, these are translations, but these, the Message is a paraphrase. It doesn't work like that. That is a dynamic scale. All translation engages in some level of paraphrasing. It has to, because that's the work of translation. So there's a scale of how much latitude and how much license and freedom are we going to use to paraphrase. So like, say, the King James or the NASB, those are going to have a much less paraphrasing, and the Message is going to have a lot more paraphrasing, but there's no category where these are translations and those are paraphrases. You just can't do that. That's an inaccurate way of representing the situation. I've come to have a deep appreciation for the NRSV, the New Revised Standard. It's kind of academic standard translation for academia. And I've come to really appreciate that translation actually quite a bit. I preach out of it now. The church that I am a part of today uses that as their translation. And I've actually grown to, first I hated it, and I've actually grown to really like it. But then there are other translations that come and go. The NET is a digital translation with so many notes that I have really grown to just love. What's my point? My point is this. I have a translation. I have my favorite translations. But when it comes to Bible study, engaging different translations is just a part of the process. And so there's no like one right translation. If I had to pick one, if I was going to go buy a Bible that I wanted to use every day, it would be the NIV. Now, speaking of Bibles, when it comes to study Bibles, what kind of Bibles do you use? My favorite personal Bible is one that's no longer in print. It used to be, it was only available in the old NIV, so the NIV 1984 edition. That's old. But when it came out, it was called the Archaeological Study Bible, the Zondervan Archaeological Study Bible. I'm not going to put all the links to all this stuff in the description of the video. I'll let you go find it. But that's the one that I used to use. It's no longer in print. You can still find it on Amazon. You can find yourself a copy, but it's going to be the old NIV, which is not as good as the new NIV. And they've made a new version of this called the Historical Cultural Backgrounds Bible. Maybe it's just called the Cultural Background Study Bible, I believe is what it might be called. The Cultural Background Study Bible. But this thing has some of the best study Bible notes, historical, archaeological articles that are in there. It's just such a great, it's just so good. I love it. Brent, my co-host, he has the Cultural Backgrounds version, and he loves it. He says it's got the same kind of stuff in it. It's one of my favorite study Bibles and one of my favorite resources. So there's that. Somebody actually sent me this, and I was eyeballing it. I was like, man, should I get that? And then somebody sent it to me, a used copy. But this has actually been a pretty great resource. The Jewish Study Bible. This one was published by Oxford. But this one is just what we would call the Old Testament, but just the Tanakh, just the Hebrew Scriptures. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. It's basically a Jewish Bible. Like, it's not a Christian Bible. It's basically a Jewish Bible, the Jewish Study Bible. And it's going to have what's called the JPS, so the Jewish Publication Society. The JPS always puts out an updated version, translation with updated footnotes. And those footnotes generally stay the same, but they'll be updated and have some changes. And this is my most recent version of a JPS. I also have like a 1997 version. I think I have a 2011 version. This is my most recent JPS, and it's great just because it gives me a Jewish perspective on the Hebrew Scriptures, and I like those footnotes. I find that to be a helpful resource. Here's another one that was also put out by Oxford, but this one is the New Testament. So if you put these two together, you'd have two sources put together by the same Oxford publishing house. But this one is New Testament. I'm like 50-50 on this one. When it comes to the footnotes and the articles in this one, I like half of them and I hate half of them. It's about a 50-50 split. At the back of this, it has some really, really great articles. And again, I don't love all the articles. Some of them I disagree with, but some great resources there. So I will use that when I'm dealing with the New Testament. And then this is Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So this is Torah and the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. I actually think it's not exactly that. No, it is. Okay, so you got Torah and you've got Nevi'im and you got Ketuvim. And not only is it his translation, Robert Alter, I just feel like is a great Hebrew language scholar, which is kind of funny how he got there. But I really appreciate his work. It'll have great footnotes and discussions in there about. It's also just beautiful and gorgeous what he's done with these. They come in this. I mean, just a pretty. It's pretty. and I like it. So, and I have some other Bibles that I just enjoy for aesthetic reasons, not because they help me study, but just because I enjoy aesthetically how they feel and look, and I love the art of what it means to publish a Bible as well, and so those are cool too. But that's really how I study the scriptures. People will often ask questions about commentaries. What commentaries do you use? I don't use commentaries. I was taught to use commentaries in Bible college. I did for a little while, and it just was not the way of approaching the scripture that I found to be helpful, especially when you're wanting to come at it from a more Jewish hermeneutic. Western Christian commentaries are not going to be the useful resource. They're probably going to push me in the opposite direction. Not that there aren't great commentaries out there. There are. I just don't have any to recommend. You'll even see some on my shelves behind me. I don't have any to necessarily recommend because it's not my go-to resource. So, that was a lot. But we get a lot of questions about those things. What's your favorite translation? What Bibles do you recommend? What resources? Commentaries? Midrash? That's really a good summary of a lot of those questions. And maybe let me just make sure I've got my whole list that we've got. Translations, Bibles. Oh, there's a question that always comes in about numerology. I don't have a great... numerology is something that you pick up as you just kind of study, about the world of Jesus. The one source that I have is from I don't even know how to say the name, Lubashan's. It's probably a German scholar from years ago. It's not a great resource, actually. It's not even one I would recommend. Like, it's not really scholarly and rooted in such a way that I would want to recommend it as a citation. But numerology is just one of those things. You got to be careful. Be careful of what you say with absolutes. Numerology changes over the next 2,000 years after Jesus. The numbers and then Jewish mysticism gets in there and messes with numerology, and you got to be careful. You just got to hold that loosely. But as you study about the world of Jesus, you will see scholars frequently reference what Jewish tradition, what the Midrash has to say about numerology, but it is very squishy. So, but you can read those contextual scholars, whether it's people like Brad Young or Edersheim. To go back, to Edersheim was kind of the staple work as this school of scholarship was just getting cranked up. People always kind of talk about and quote Edersheim, but I don't have a great source to give you for numerology. Be careful about how you quote that stuff. It's a little squishy. If you feel like it's just too fast and loose for you, then don't put your anchor down there and just keep studying and see what you pick up. But I don't have a great source for that either. So, all right, that covers most of the sourcing questions that come in on a regular basis. I hope those things are helpful and useful. This stuff makes me excited because if you're getting into this, it means you're studying the text. It means you're studying the scripture, and nothing could get me more excited. So keep at it. See what there is to learn, and we'll all be a little better for it.